Hello, and welcome to the Sleep Library. Wherever you are in the world, and whatever time it is as you press play, we're honored to keep you company as you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's story, take a moment to settle in. Feel the warmth of your blanket, the stillness around you, and the space you've made to simply let go. If you enjoy this experience, we invite you to subscribe to the Sleep Library. We create gentle, slow, and calming stories to help you sleep. Stories you won't hear anywhere else. And in the comments below, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Your words help us build a global, restful little community. One quiet listener at a time. Now, if you're ready, let's travel back to a time not often remembered.
Welcome to another journey through history's quiet corners, where we explore the forgotten chapters that shaped our world. Tonight, we delve into one of Victorian society's most intimate and misunderstood professions, the mourning photographer. Close your eyes, settle in, and let us travel back to an era when death was both feared and celebrated, when families gathered not just to say goodbye, but to capture one final, lasting image of their beloved departed. Picture, if you will, a foggy London morning in 1843. The gaslight flickers through heavy curtains as a horse-drawn carriage comes to a gentle stop outside a modest Victorian home. The driver speaks in hushed tones, for this is no ordinary visit. From the carriage emerges a man carrying a large wooden box, brass fittings gleaming dully in the pale morning light. He is a daguerreotypist, one of the new breed of image makers, and today he has come to perform what many consider his most sacred duty. Inside the house, a family waits in their parlor, dressed in their finest black clothing. On the settee lies their youngest daughter, pale and still, surrounded by white roses and her favorite doll. She appears to be sleeping peacefully, but this sleep is eternal. The photographer sets up his equipment with practiced reverence, knowing that what he captures today will be the family's only visual memory of their child, their most treasured possession for years to come. This scene, repeated countless times across Victorian England and America, marks the beginning of one of history's most poignant professions, post-mortem photography, or as it was more gently known, mourning photography. To understand how photographing the dead became not just acceptable but essential in Victorian society, we must first journey back to the 1830s, when the world was on the cusp of a revolutionary invention that would change how humanity saw itself forever. In 1839, Louis-Jacques Daguerre announced his photographic process to the French Academy of Sciences. The daguerreotype, as it came to be known, was nothing short of miraculous to people who had never seen their own reflection captured permanently on a silver-plated sheet of copper. For the first time in human history, light itself could be harnessed to create permanent images with unprecedented detail and clarity. The announcement sent shockwaves through artistic and scientific communities across Europe and America. Within months, daguerreotype studios were opening in major cities, and photographers were experimenting with this magical new medium. But there was one significant problem that would inadvertently give birth to the mourning photography profession: the extremely long exposure times required to capture an image. Early daguerreotypes required subjects to remain perfectly still for anywhere from 15 seconds to several minutes, depending on lighting conditions. For living subjects, this created considerable challenges. Special head braces and body clamps were invented to help people remain motionless, but even the slightest movement would result in a blurred, ghostly image. Children, in particular, struggled with the lengthy stillness required, often resulting in disappointing portraits. It was perhaps inevitable that photographers would realize the dead made perfect subjects. They could remain perfectly still for as long as needed, allowing for the sharp, clear images that the daguerreotype process could produce under ideal conditions. What began as a practical solution to a technical problem would soon evolve into a deeply meaningful ritual for grieving families. The first known post-mortem photograph was taken in 1841, just 2 years after Daguerre's announcement. It depicted a young child, posed as if sleeping, surrounded by flowers. The image quality was remarkable for its time, capturing every delicate detail with a clarity that painted portraits could never achieve. Word of this new possibility spread quickly through communities, particularly among those who had lost children. In Victorian society, death was an ever-present reality, especially for children. Infant mortality rates were staggeringly high, with estimates suggesting that 1 in 5 children died before reaching their 5th birthday. Diseases like cholera, tuberculosis, and diphtheria swept through communities with terrifying regularity. For many families, particularly those of modest means, a post-mortem photograph might be their only chance to have a portrait of their child. Prior to photography, families had relied on painted death portraits, a tradition dating back centuries among the wealthy. These paintings, known as mourning portraits, typically depicted the deceased in repose, often surrounded by symbolic elements like flowers, religious imagery, or personal belongings. However, painted portraits were expensive and required considerable artistic skill to achieve a realistic likeness. Many families simply could not afford such luxuries. The daguerreotype changed everything. While still expensive by working-class standards, a photographic portrait cost significantly less than a painted one and captured an exact likeness rather than an artist's interpretation. For grieving parents who had never been able to afford any kind of portrait of their living child, a post-mortem photograph represented their only opportunity to preserve their child's image forever. Early mourning photographers were typically established portrait photographers who had recognized an additional market for their services. They understood that photographing the deceased required special sensitivity and skill, both technical and emotional. These pioneers of post-mortem photography developed techniques that would define the profession for decades to come. The technical challenges were considerable. Unlike living subjects who could be coached and positioned, deceased subjects required careful handling and creative solutions to achieve natural-looking poses. Photographers learned to work quickly, as bodies deteriorated rapidly, especially in warmer weather. They developed methods for supporting bodies in lifelike positions and became skilled at using cosmetics and strategic lighting to give their subjects a peaceful, sleeping appearance. One of the earliest and most successful mourning photographers was Jeremiah Gurney, who opened his New York studio in 1840. Gurney quickly gained a reputation for his sensitive handling of bereaved families and his ability to create beautiful, dignified post-mortem portraits. His studio became a gathering place for grieving families, and his work set the standard for professional mourning photography in America. Gurney's approach emphasized the importance of creating a peaceful, reverent atmosphere during the photography session. He would arrive at a family's home with not just his camera equipment, but also flowers, fabric, and other props that could enhance the portrait. He understood that for many families, this would be one of their most emotionally significant experiences, and he treated each session with appropriate solemnity. The social acceptance of post-mortem photography in Victorian society can be attributed to several cultural factors. First, Victorians had a very different relationship with death than we do today. Death was not hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes. It occurred at home, surrounded by family. Children grew up witnessing death as a natural part of life, and elaborate mourning rituals were an important part of social custom. Victorian mourning practices were highly codified, with specific rules governing everything from clothing to social activities during bereavement periods. Post-mortem photography fit naturally into these existing customs, providing families with a tangible memento of their loved one that could be displayed in the home alongside other mourning artifacts like locks of hair, mourning jewelry, and memorial cards. The religious climate of the era also contributed to the acceptance of death photography. Many Christian denominations taught that the soul departed the body at death, leaving behind only an empty vessel. Photographing this vessel was not seen as disturbing the dead, but rather as preserving a memory of the earthly form that had housed the departed soul. Some religious leaders even endorsed the practice, seeing it as a way for families to find comfort in their grief. The economic realities of Victorian life also played a crucial role in the development of mourning photography. For working-class families, spending money on luxuries like portrait photography was often impossible during normal circumstances. However, the death of a family member, particularly a child, was considered an extraordinary circumstance that justified extraordinary expenses. Families would often scrimp and save for months to afford a post-mortem photograph, viewing it as their final gift to their departed loved one. The photography studios that specialized in mourning portraits developed unique business models to serve this market. Many offered payment plans that allowed families to spread the cost over several months. Some photographers maintained relationships with local churches and charitable organizations that could help subsidize the cost for the poorest families. It was not uncommon for photographers to reduce their fees or even work for free when photographing the children of particularly destitute families. As word of mourning photography spread, the demand grew rapidly. By the late 1840s, most major cities in America and Europe had at least one photographer who advertised post-mortem services. Rural areas were served by traveling photographers who would make circuits through smaller towns and villages, often staying for several days to accommodate all the families who had been waiting for their services. The early mourning photographers quickly learned that success in their profession required more than just technical skill with a camera. They needed to be part artist, part psychologist, and part minister. They were often called upon to comfort grieving families, to help them navigate the complex emotions surrounding their loss, and to create images that would provide lasting comfort in the years to come. These photographers developed a unique aesthetic for their work that distinguished mourning portraits from regular portrait photography. They used softer lighting to create a more ethereal effect, often positioning the camera to capture the deceased from slightly above, which created a more peaceful, sleeping appearance. They became masters of composition, using flowers, fabric, and other props to create beautiful, harmonious images that celebrated the life of the deceased rather than simply documenting their death. The props used in early mourning photography were carefully chosen for their symbolic significance. White flowers, particularly roses and lilies, represented purity and resurrection. Religious symbols like crosses or prayer books indicated the deceased's faith and the family's hope for eternal reunion. Personal belongings like favorite toys for children or books for adults helped to personalize the portrait and remind viewers of the deceased's life rather than their death. One particularly touching aspect of early mourning photography was the inclusion of family members in the portraits. Parents would often pose with their deceased children, creating family portraits that captured both grief and love. These images served multiple purposes. They provided comfort to the surviving family members, they demonstrated the family's unity in their grief, and they created a visual record of the family at a crucial moment in their history. The technical quality of early post-mortem photographs was often superior to portraits of living subjects, precisely because the deceased could remain perfectly still during the long exposure times. This ironic advantage meant that mourning portraits frequently became a family's finest photographic record, treasured not just for their emotional significance, but also for their exceptional clarity and detail. As the 1840s drew to a close, mourning photography had established itself as an essential service in Victorian society. What had begun as a practical solution to a technical problem had evolved into a sophisticated art form that provided comfort to countless grieving families. The photographers who specialized in this work had developed unique skills and sensibilities that set them apart from their colleagues who focused solely on the living. The success of these early mourning photographers laid the foundation for what would become a thriving profession throughout the Victorian era. They had proven that there was both a market and a need for their services, and they had established the technical and artistic standards that would guide the profession for decades to come. As we prepare to continue our journey through the world of Victorian mourning photography, we leave these early pioneers in their darkrooms, carefully developing the images that would bring comfort to grieving families across the English-speaking world. Their work represented more than just a new application of photographic technology. It represented a new way of dealing with grief, of preserving memory, and of finding beauty in the midst of sorrow. The daguerreotype plates they created in those early years still survive in museums and private collections today, silent witnesses to both the artistry of their creators and the love of the families who commissioned them. In these images, we can still see the careful attention to detail, the reverent composition, and the deep humanity that characterized the best work of the mourning photographers. Tomorrow night, we will continue our exploration by examining the technical craft that these photographers mastered, the cameras and chemistry that made their art possible, and the specialized techniques they developed for working with their unique subjects. Until then, rest well, and remember that even in Victorian society's darkest moments, there were those who worked to preserve light, memory, and love through the magic of early photography. Welcome back to our quiet journey through Victorian history's most intimate profession. Tonight, we venture into the photographer's darkroom, where science met art in service of grief and memory. Close your eyes and imagine the dim, red-lit chambers where these masters of light and shadow worked their careful magic, transforming silver and glass into eternal portraits of the departed. Picture a small room behind a London photography studio in 1847. There is thick with the sharp scent of chemicals silver nitrate, mercury vapor, and iodine fumes that make the eyes water and the throat burn. In the corner sits a massive wooden camera, its brass fittings gleaming in the gaslight. Nearby, glass plates rest in careful rows, waiting to be transformed into windows to the past. This is where the mourning photographer practiced his mysterious craft, where death met chemistry in the pursuit of immortality. The technical challenges facing Victorian mourning photographers were unlike anything encountered in conventional portraiture. They worked against time itself, racing to capture images before natural processes made their subjects unsuitable for photography. They battled poor lighting conditions in homes filled with heavy curtains and grief. They manipulated chemistry and optics to create images that would provide comfort rather than horror, beauty rather than decay. To understand their craft, we must first examine the daguerreotype process that dominated early mourning photography. Named after its inventor, Louis Daguerre, this revolutionary technique created images on silver-plated copper sheets through a complex dance of chemistry and light that seemed like alchemy to most observers. The daguerreotype process began long before the photographer ever entered a grieving family's home. In his studio, the photographer would begin by selecting a copper plate, typically measuring anywhere from 2.5 by 3.25 inches for a small portrait to 8.5 by 11 inches for larger family compositions. The plate had to be perfectly clean, polished to a mirror finish using increasingly fine abrasives until it gleamed like still water under lamplight. Once polished, the plate was secured in a sensitizing box, a light-tight container where it would be exposed to iodine vapor. The photographer would heat small crystals of iodine in the bottom of the box, creating purple vapors that rose to coat the silver surface with a thin layer of silver iodide. This coating was what made the plate sensitive to light, transforming an ordinary piece of metal into a capture device for images. The sensitization process required careful timing and temperature control. Too little exposure to the iodine vapor, and the plate would not be sensitive enough to record fine details. Too much, and the resulting image would be muddy and indistinct. Experienced mourning photographers could judge the proper sensitization by the color of the plate, which shifted from silver to gold to rose to purple as the iodine coating thickened. The cameras used for mourning photography were substantial affairs, built more like pieces of furniture than the portable devices we might imagine. A typical daguerreotype camera consisted of two wooden boxes, one sliding inside the other to allow for focusing. The outer box held the lens, while the inner box held the sensitized plate. The entire apparatus was mounted on a heavy wooden tripod to prevent the slightest movement during the long exposures. These cameras were often custom built by skilled craftsmen who understood the specific needs of photographers. The wood was usually mahogany or cherry, selected for its stability and resistance to warping. The corners were reinforced with brass fittings, and the interior was lined with black velvet to prevent unwanted reflections. A good camera represented a significant investment, often costing more than a skilled craftsman earned in several months. The lenses available to early mourning photographers were simple but effective. Most used a Petzval lens, invented by Hungarian mathematician Joseph Petzval in 1840. These lenses were remarkable for their time, gathering far more light than previous designs and allowing for short exposure times. A typical Petzval lens had an aperture of f3.6, making it about 16 times faster than the simple meniscus lenses used in earlier cameras. However, even with these advanced lenses, exposure times for daguerreotypes typically ranged from 30 seconds to several minutes, depending on lighting conditions. This created unique challenges for mourning photographers, who often worked in dimly lit Victorian parlours with heavy curtains drawn as a sign of mourning. They became masters of available light, learning to position mirrors and reflectors to maximize the illumination falling on their subjects. The morning hours were preferred for mourning photography, not just for the quality of natural light, but for practical reasons related to the condition of the deceased. Bodies were typically photographed within 24 to 48 hours of death before significant decomposition began. Photographers would often be summoned in the middle of the night and work by candlelight and oil lamps if necessary, though the results were rarely as satisfactory as daylight exposures. Once the sensitized plate was loaded into the camera and the exposure calculated, the actual photographing process began. The photographer would remove the lens cap to begin the exposure, then count the seconds or minutes required. During this time, absolute stillness was essential. Any vibration from footsteps, closing doors, or even heavy breathing too close to the camera could ruin the image. This requirement for stillness was actually an advantage when photographing the deceased, as they could maintain perfect poses for any length of time. However, it created challenges when living family members were included in the portrait. Mourning photographers developed various techniques to help the living remain motionless, including special clamps and braces that could be hidden behind fabric or flowers. After the exposure was complete, the real magic began in the darkroom. The exposed plate was developed using mercury vapor, a process that was both dangerous and precisely timed. The photographer would place the plate face down over a shallow dish of liquid mercury, then heat the mercury gently with a spirit lamp or gas burner. As the mercury warmed, it formed vapors that rose to amalgamate with the silver particles exposed to light, creating the visible image. The development process required careful temperature control and timing. Too little heat, and the image would be weak and barely visible. Too much heat, and the mercury vapors could create a uniform fog across the entire plate, obliterating any image. Experienced photographers could judge the proper development by watching the image slowly appear on the plate, like a ghost materializing from silver mist. The mercury development process was extremely hazardous, though Victorian photographers were only beginning to understand the health risks. Mercury vapor attacks the nervous system, causing tremors, memory loss, and eventually death. Many early photographers suffered from what they called the photographer's shakes, not realizing that their profession was slowly poisoning them. Proper ventilation was crucial, but often inadequate in small darkrooms. Once development was complete, the plate was fixed in a solution of sodium thiosulfate, commonly known as IPO. This chemical dissolved the remaining silver iodide that had not been exposed to light, preventing the image from continuing to darken. The fixing process had to be carefully timed to short, and the image would continue to change over time. Too long, and the delicate silver particles that formed the image could be dissolved away. After fixing, the daguerreotype was thoroughly washed in clean water to remove all chemical residues, then dry carefully to prevent water spots. The finished plate was often toned with gold chloride solution to improve the image contrast and provide protection against tarnishing. This toning process gave daguerreotypes their characteristic warm, golden tone that many people found more pleasing than the neutral grey of untoned images. The final step was protecting the delicate surface of the daguerreotype. The image existed as microscopic particles of silver amalgam on the surface of the copper plate, making it extremely vulnerable to abrasion. Even the lightest touch could permanently damage the image. Daguerreotypes were therefore sealed behind glass in protective cases, often elaborate affairs made of leather, wood, or thermoplastic with gold-plated clasps and hinges. These cases became works of art in themselves, particularly for mourning portraits. They were often lined with silk or velvet in somber colors, deep purple, midnight blue, or black. Some featured engraved plates with the deceased's name and dates, while others included small compartments for locks of hair or other mementos. The case was designed to be both protective and beautiful, worthy of the precious image it contained. The chemistry of daguerreotype photography was complex and demanding, requiring photographers to be part scientist, part artist. They had to understand not just the technical aspects of the process, but also how different conditions affected their results. The temperature and humidity of the darkroom, the age and purity of the chemicals, the condition of the copper plates, all of these factors influenced the final image quality. Mourning photographers often had to work under less than ideal conditions, making house calls with portable darkroom equipment. They developed ingenious solutions for maintaining chemical quality while traveling. Some used specially designed carriages equipped with darkrooms, complete with chemical storage and ventilation systems. Others worked with local photographers in different towns, relying on their colleagues to provide fresh chemicals and processing facilities. The quality control in early daguerreotype chemistry was inconsistent by modern standards. Photographers often had to mix their own solutions from raw chemicals, testing and adjusting concentrations through trial and error. A batch of bad chemicals could ruin days of work, while perfectly mixed solutions could produce images of stunning clarity and detail. Storage of daguerreotype chemicals was another challenge. Silver nitrate, one of the key chemicals, was expensive and had to be kept in dark brown bottles to prevent decomposition from light. Mercury was stored in iron flasks and had to be kept away from heat sources to prevent dangerous vapor formation. Iodine crystals were kept in stoppered bottles and could sublimate directly from solid to vapor, making storage containers crucial for maintaining proper concentrations. The cameras themselves required constant maintenance and calibration. The sliding box mechanism had to move smoothly without any play or wobble that could affect focus. The lens had to be kept scrupulously clean, as even the tiniest speck of dust could create defects in the final image. The wooden construction was susceptible to changes in humidity, which could affect the camera's dimensions and therefore its focusing accuracy. Mourning photographers became skilled at improvisation, adapting their equipment to work in the challenging environment of Victorian homes. They learned to position mirrors and white sheets to redirect window light onto their subjects. They developed techniques for working in small rooms crowded with furniture and family members. They created portable backgrounds and props that could transform any domestic space into a temporary studio. The lens calculations required for proper exposure were complex, involving factors like aperture, focal length, plate sensitivity, and available light. Photographers used exposure meters, simple devices that used photochemical reactions to estimate proper exposure times. However, these were often unreliable, and experienced photographers learned to judge exposure by taking into account factors like the time of day, weather conditions, and the reflectivity of their subject's clothing. Color sensitivity was another technical challenge. Early daguerreotype materials were sensitive primarily to blue and ultraviolet light, making them relatively insensitive to red light. This meant that red objects appeared very dark in daguerreotypes, while blue objects appeared lighter than they would to the human eye. Mourning photographers learned to compensate for this by their choice of clothing, flowers, and props for their compositions. The silver-plated copper plates used for daguerreotypes were expensive and had to be handled with extreme care. A single fingerprint on the silver surface could ruin a plate, making it unusable for photography. Plates were stored in padded boxes and handled only with clean cotton gloves. Damaged plates could sometimes be repolished and reused, but this was time-consuming and reduced the quality of subsequent images. Quality control in daguerreotype production was largely a matter of the photographer's skill and experience. There were no standardized procedures or quality metrics. Each photographer developed his own methods through trial and error. The best mourning photographers kept detailed notes on their procedures, recording exposure times, chemical concentrations, and development times for different conditions. These notebooks became valuable references that could be consulted when facing similar situations in the future. The economics of daguerreotype chemistry played a significant role in the business of mourning photography. Silver nitrate was the most expensive component, often costing more per ounce than the silver plates themselves. Photographers had to balance the cost of materials against the quality of results, sometimes racing chemicals longer than ideal to maintain profitability while still producing acceptable images. As the 1850s progressed, technical improvements in daguerreotype chemistry and equipment made mourning photography more accessible and reliable. Better lenses reduced exposure times, more consistent chemicals improved image quality, and refined techniques made the process less hazardous for photographers. However, the fundamental challenges remain the same: capturing light and preserving memory through the careful manipulation of chemistry and optics. The technical mastery required for successful mourning photography set these specialists apart from ordinary portrait photographers. They worked under more difficult conditions, with less forgiving subjects, and with the added pressure of knowing that their work could never be repeated. There was no opportunity for a second session, no chance to correct mistakes or improve composition. The mourning photographer had to get it right the first time, every time. This technical expertise, combined with the emotional sensitivity required for working with grieving families, created a unique professional identity. Mourning photographers were craftsmen, scientists, and artists rolled into one, practitioners of a discipline that demanded both technical precision and human compassion. As we close tonight's exploration of the technical craft behind mourning photography, we leave our Victorian chemist artists in their darkrooms, watching silver images slowly materialize in mercury vapor, capturing light and preserving love through the alchemy of early photography. Tomorrow, we will examine how these technical masters applied their skills to the delicate art of posing the dead, creating images of peace and beauty from the raw material of grief and loss. Welcome back to our hushed journey through Victorian history's most tender profession. Tonight, we enter the sacred space between life and death, where skilled hands and compassionate hearts work together to create final portraits of transcendent beauty. Close your eyes and imagine the quiet reverence of a Victorian parlour, where a mourning photographer carefully arranged flowers and fabric, transforming grief into art through the gentle manipulation of light and shadow. Picture a modest home in Boston, 1851. The autumn light filters softly through lace curtains as a photographer named Samuel works with infinite patience in the family's front parlor. Before him lies a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, who has succumbed to consumption after a long illness. Her family has dressed her in her wedding gown, never worn, and surrounded her with white roses from her mother's garden. Samuel's task is not merely to document her death, but to create an image that will bring comfort for decades to come, a portrait that captures not the absence of life, but the eternal presence of love. This delicate work required skills that went far beyond technical photographic knowledge. Mourning photographers became masters of illusion, artists who could transform the harsh reality of death into images of peaceful repose. They learned to read the subtle language of grief, to understand what each family needed from their final portrait, and to create compositions that honored both the deceased and the living who would treasure these images forever. The art of posing the deceased began with careful observation and planning. When a mourning photographer arrived at a home, he would first spend time with the family, learning about their loved one's personality, preferences, and the circumstances of their death. Was this a sudden loss or the end of a long illness? Had the deceased been photographed in life? Or would this be their first and only portrait? Did the family have specific requests or cultural traditions that should be honored? These conversations were crucial for understanding how to approach the posing process. A child who had died suddenly might be posed as if simply sleeping in their own bed, surrounded by favorite toys and books. An elderly patriarch might be positioned in his favorite chair, pipe nearby, as if he had merely dozed off while reading his evening paper. Each pose had to tell a story that would resonate with the family's memories and provide comfort in their grief. The physical challenges of posing deceased subjects were considerable and required both technical skill and emotional fortitude. Rigor mortis, the stiffening of muscles after death, typically began within 2 to 6 hours of death and reached its peak after 12 hours. This natural process could make positioning extremely difficult, as limbs might be locked in awkward positions that were unsuitable for photography. Experienced mourning photographers learned to work around rigor mortis through careful timing and gentle manipulation. In cases where rigor mortis had already set in, they developed techniques for gradual positioning, slowly and respectfully moving joints to achieve more natural poses. They understood the progression of rigor mortis and knew that it would eventually pass, typically after 24 to 48 hours, allowing for easier positioning if the photography session could be delayed. Temperature played a crucial role in the photographer's planning. In colder months, bodies remained suitable for photography longer, giving families and photographers more time to arrange the session. Summer heat accelerated decomposition and made timing more critical. Mourning photographers often worked through the night during warm weather, using ice and other cooling methods to preserve their subjects until the session could be completed. The basic principle of mourning photography posing was to create the illusion of peaceful sleep rather than death. This required careful attention to every detail of the composition, from the angle of the head to the position of the hands to the arrangement of clothing and drapery. The goal was to create images that families could display proudly in their homes without causing distress to visitors who might view them. Eyes were perhaps the most crucial element in creating convincing posthumous portraits. Victorian mourning photographers developed several techniques for dealing with the challenge of closed or partially open eyes. The simplest approach was to ensure that the eyelids were fully closed and positioned naturally. This sometimes required gentle manipulation or the use of small weights placed carefully on the eyelids during the exposure. For subjects whose eyes had remained partially open after death, photographers learned to use strategic lighting and camera angles to minimize the unsettling effect. Side lighting could cast shadows that obscured partially open eyes, while careful positioning of the head could hide any asymmetry between the eyes. Some photographers became skilled at using cosmetics to create the appearance of naturally closed eyes, though this required considerable artistic ability. Perhaps the most controversial technique was the painting of eyes directly onto the closed eyelids or onto the finished photograph itself. Some mourning photographers offered this service to families who specifically requested that their loved one appear to be looking directly at the camera. This technique required steady hands and artistic skill, as poorly painted eyes could create a grotesque rather than comforting effect. The positioning of hands was another critical element in creating natural-looking posthumous portraits. Hands that had stiffened in awkward positions could destroy the illusion of peaceful repose. Photographers learned to work with families to position hands in meaningful ways, perhaps folded in prayer, holding a flower, or grasping a beloved object, like a book or piece of jewelry. Young children were often posed with their hands holding favorite toys or positioned as if they were simply napping. Adult subjects might have their hands arranged to suggest their profession or interests. A minister might hold a Bible. A mother might have her hands positioned as if she had been sewing. A gentleman might appear to be holding his pocket watch. These details help to personalize the portrait and remind viewers of the subject's life rather than their death. Clothing selection and arrangement required careful consideration. Families typically dressed their deceased loved ones in their finest garments, Sunday best for most people. Wedding attire for young women who had never married. Military uniforms for veterans. The mourning photographer had to ensure that clothing lay naturally and attractively, without bunching or gaping that would destroy the illusion of natural repose. White clothing was particularly popular for children and young adults, symbolizing purity and innocence. These garments photographed beautifully in the daguerreotype process and created striking contrast against dark backgrounds. However, white fabric also showed every wrinkle and imperfection, requiring careful arrangement and sometimes pinning from behind to create smooth, elegant lines. The use of props and symbolic elements was an essential part of the mourning photographer's art. Flowers were the most common props, with different varieties chosen for their symbolic meanings. White roses represented purity and eternal love. Lilies symbolized resurrection and the hope of eternal life. And forget-me-nots carried the obvious message of remembrance. The photographer had to arrange these floral elements to enhance the composition, while ensuring they appeared natural rather than artificial. Religious symbols played important roles in many mourning portraits. Crosses, prayer books, and rosaries were commonly included, positioned to suggest the deceased's faith and the family's hope for reunion in the afterlife. These elements had to be integrated seamlessly into the composition, appearing as natural extensions of the subject's personality rather than awkward additions. Personal belongings help to individualize posthumous portraits and connect them to the subject's life and interests. Children might be photographed with favorite dolls, toy soldiers, or picture books. Adults could be shown with items that reflected their professions, hobbies, or achievements, musical instruments, tools, books, or cherished heirlooms. The key was selecting items that enhanced rather than cluttered the composition. The creation of family group portraits, including deceased members, required exceptional skill in both posing and psychology. These compositions typically showed living family members gathered around the deceased, creating touching scenes of farewell and unity in grief. The mourning photographer had to balance the need for natural-looking poses among the living participants with the challenge of integrating a deceased subject into the group. Children were often posed with deceased siblings, creating poignant images of innocence confronting loss. Parents might be shown holding deceased infants or positioned protectively near deceased children. These family portraits served multiple purposes. They documented the family unit at a crucial moment. They provided comfort to the survivors, and they created lasting records of relationships that death had severed. The positioning of living subjects in family mourning portraits required special techniques. Family members had to remain perfectly still during the long exposure times, but they also had to appear natural and emotionally engaged with the scene. Photographers used hidden supports and braces to help living subjects maintain their poses, while coaching them on appropriate expressions and hand positions. Lighting played a crucial role in creating the ethereal quality that characterized the best morning photography. Photographers preferred soft, diffused light that would minimize harsh shadows and create an overall sense of peace and tranquility. North-facing windows provided ideal lighting conditions, offering steady illumination without the harsh contrast that direct sunlight could create. Reflectors and mirrors were essential tools for controlling light and shadow in morning portraits. White sheets or boards could be positioned to bounce soft light onto the subject's face, eliminating unflattering shadows and creating even illumination. Photographers learned to use available light creatively, sometimes waiting for specific times of day when the light would be perfect for their particular setup. The backgrounds chosen for morning portraits were typically simple and non-distracting, designed to focus attention on the subject rather than competing with them for visual interest. Dark fabrics were common, creating dramatic contrast with pale skin and light-colored clothing. Some photographers used painted backdrops depicting peaceful scenes like gardens or heavenly clouds, though these required considerable artistic skill to execute convincingly. Drapery and fabric arrangement became a specialized skill among morning photographers. Carefully positioned cloth could hide the mechanical supports used to position subjects, create flattering compositions, and add symbolic elements to the portrait. The flow and fold of fabric had to appear natural despite being artificially arranged, requiring an understanding of how different materials behaved and photographed. The camera angle and height were critical factors in creating successful morning portraits. Slightly elevated camera positions often created more flattering perspectives, while careful attention to the angle could minimize any signs of illness or injury that might have preceded death. The photographer had to balance technical considerations with aesthetic ones, creating compositions that were both photographically successful and emotionally satisfying. Timing the exposure required careful coordination of all elements. Once the pose was perfected, the props arranged, and the lighting optimized, the photographer had to work quickly to capture the image before any elements shifted or changed. This was particularly challenging in group portraits where multiple living subjects had to maintain their poses simultaneously. The psychological aspects of posing that did extended beyond the technical challenges to encompass the emotional needs of grieving families. Photographers often found themselves serving as informal counselors, helping families process their grief while creating meaningful final portraits. They learned to read the emotional dynamics within families and adjust their approach accordingly. Some families wanted to be actively involved in posing their loved one, finding comfort in these final acts of care and attention. Others preferred to leave the photographer to work alone, trusting his expertise while they grieved privately in other rooms. The skilled morning photographer learned to gauge each family's needs and adapt his working style to provide the most comfort and support possible. The creation of multiple poses and compositions was common in morning photography, allowing families to choose the image that best captured their memories of their loved one. A child might be photographed sleeping peacefully in bed, then posed sitting in a favorite chair, and finally shown with beloved toys or siblings. This approach gave families options and helped ensure that the final selection would provide lasting comfort. Documentation and record keeping became important aspects of the posing process. Many morning photographers kept detailed notes about their techniques, successful compositions, and family preferences. These records served as references for future work and helped build reputations for sensitivity and skill within their communities. The training and development of expertise in posthumous posing was largely through apprenticeship and personal experience. There were no formal schools or textbooks for morning photography. Each photographer developed his skills through practice, observation, and consultation with more experienced colleagues, the best practitioners became known for their ability to create beautiful, comforting images under the most challenging circumstances. Regional and cultural variations in posing styles reflected different attitudes toward death and mourning traditions. Rural photographers might emphasize simplicity and natural elements, while urban practitioners could offer more elaborate compositions with expensive props and backgrounds. Cultural backgrounds influenced choices in clothing, religious symbols, and family arrangements. The seasonal aspects of mourning photography affected both the practical and aesthetic elements of posing. Spring flowers brought fresh possibilities for symbolic arrangements, while winter sessions might emphasize warm indoor settings with fireplaces and cozy textiles. The photographer had to adapt his techniques and prop selections to work harmoniously with the time of year and available materials. Quality control in posing was ultimately judged by the family's satisfaction with the final portrait. A successful mourning photograph was one that brought comfort rather than distress, that captured the essence of the deceased person's character, and that created a lasting memorial worthy of prominent display in the family home. The photographer's reputation depended on consistently achieving these emotional and artistic goals. As we conclude tonight's exploration of the gentle art of posing the dead, we leave our Victorian artists in their quiet parlours, working with infinite patience to transform sorrow into beauty, death into peaceful repose, and grief into lasting love. Their skilled hands arranged flowers and fabric, positioned gentle forms, and captured light in ways that brought comfort to countless mourning families across the English-speaking world. Tomorrow, we will focus on perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the mourning photographer's work, the creation of final portraits for children whose lives had been cut tragically short, examining how these compassionate artists helped families cope with the devastating loss of their youngest members. Welcome back to our quiet journey through Victorian history's most tender profession. Tonight, we approach the most heartbreaking chapter in our story, the creation of final portraits for children whose brief lives had ended too soon. Close your eyes and imagine the hushed sorrow of a Victorian nursery, where a mourning photographer worked with infinite gentleness to capture one last image of innocence at rest, transforming a parent's deepest grief into a treasured memory that would endure for generations. Picture a small bedroom in Philadelphia, 1854. The winter light is pale and soft through frost-covered windows. In a child's bed, surrounded by her favorite dolls and a worn teddy bear, lies 5-year-old Emma, who succumbed to scarlet fever just 2 days ago. Her mother has dressed her in the white dress she wore to her cousin's wedding last spring, and white roses from the conservatory frame her peaceful face. The photographer, a gentleman named William who has performed this sacred duty for dozens of families, arranges his equipment with reverent care, knowing that this single image will become the family's most precious possession. This scene, repeated in countless homes across Victorian America and Britain, represents perhaps the most emotionally demanding aspect of mourning photography. The death of a child was considered the cruelest blow fate could deliver to a family, and the creation of a final portrait became both a necessity and a form of devotion, the last act of parental love that could be performed for a lost child. To understand the profound importance of childhood mourning photography, we must first confront the stark reality of child mortality in the Victorian era. Death was a constant companion to Victorian families, but it visited children with particular cruelty. Disease, accident, and the simple fragility of young life combined to create mortality rates that would horrify modern parents. In urban areas, as many as 40% of children died before reaching their 5th birthday. Cholera, diphtheria, scarlet fever, whooping cough, and consumption swept through communities with devastating regularity. Accidents were common in a world without modern safety measures. Children fell into wells, were kicked by horses, or burned in household fires. Even the wealthy could not protect their children from the diseases that thrived in crowded cities and poor sanitation conditions. For many families, particularly those of modest means, a post-mortem photograph might be their only portrait of their child. Living children were difficult subjects for early photography, unable to remain still for the long exposure times required. The ironic tragedy was that death often provided the first opportunity for a perfect portrait, a child finally still enough for the camera to capture every beloved detail. The emotional weight of photographing deceased children fell heavily on the mourning photographers who specialized in this work. These were not simply technicians operating cameras, but compassionate individuals who understood that they were creating what might be a family's most treasured possession. They developed special techniques, equipment, and approaches specifically for working with children and their grieving families. The physical challenges of photographing deceased children differed significantly from adult subjects. Children's smaller size made positioning easier in some ways, but created unique compositional challenges. Their delicate features required different lighting techniques to capture properly. Their clothing, toys, and surroundings had to be arranged to tell the story of a life cut short while still creating a comforting, beautiful image. Timing was even more critical when photographing children. Their smaller bodies were more susceptible to rapid changes after death, making it essential to work quickly while still maintaining the reverence and care that families expected. Photographers often worked through the night, using oil lamps and candles when necessary, to capture images before natural processes made photography impossible. The most common pose for deceased children was the sleeping composition, where the child was positioned as if simply taking a peaceful nap. This approach required careful attention to every detail: the angle of the head on the pillow, the position of small hands, the arrangement of blankets and clothing. The goal was to create an image so natural that viewers might believe the child was merely sleeping and could wake at any moment. Beds and cradles were the most popular settings for these sleeping portraits. The child's own bed, familiar and comforting, provided the perfect backdrop for a final portrait. Favorite pillows, blankets, and bedtime companions were arranged around the small figure. For infants, elaborate christening gowns or the finest baby clothes available were chosen, creating images of angelic innocence. The selection and arrangement of toys played a crucial role in childhood mourning photography. These objects told the story of the child's personality and interests, transforming a death portrait into a celebration of life. A little girl might be photographed with her favorite doll cradled in her arms, while a boy could be shown with toy soldiers or a beloved wooden horse nearby. Books were particularly popular props for children's portraits, symbolizing both education and the stories that would remain unfinished. A child might be posed as if having fallen asleep while reading, with the book still open beside them. Fairy tale books, Bible story collections, and children's poetry volumes were common choices, their colorful illustrations adding visual interest to the composition. Flowers held special significance in children's mourning photography. White flowers, roses, lilies, baby's breath symbolized innocence and purity. They were arranged around the child like a gentle garden, creating frames of natural beauty that soften the reality of death. Some photographers became skilled at creating elaborate floral arrangements that transformed the child's resting place into something resembling a fairy tale illustration. The clothing chosen for children's final portraits carried deep symbolic meaning. White was overwhelmingly preferred, representing purity, innocence, and the belief that children who died young went directly to heaven. Christening gowns were popular choices for infants, while older children might wear their best Sunday dress or the outfit they had worn for a special occasion like a birthday or holiday celebration. Some families chose to dress their deceased children in clothing that reflected their personalities or interests. A little boy who loved playing soldier might be photographed in a child-sized military uniform, while a girl who enjoyed dancing could wear her prettiest party dress. These choices helped to personalize the portrait and celebrate the child's individual character. The inclusion of living family members in children's mourning portraits created some of the most emotionally powerful images in Victorian photography. Parents, siblings, and grandparents were often positioned around the deceased child, creating family compositions that captured both grief and unity. These group portraits served multiple purposes. They documented the family at a crucial moment. They provided comfort to the survivors, and they created visual records of relationships that death had severed. Mothers were frequently photographed holding deceased infants, creating Madonna-like images of ultimate sorrow and love. These portraits required exceptional sensitivity from the photographer, as he had to balance the mother's grief with the technical requirements of the photographic process. The mother often had to remain perfectly still while holding her dead child for several minutes during the exposure, a test of emotional and physical endurance that few could manage without considerable support. Sibling portraits with deceased children created particularly poignant images. Living brothers and sisters were posed as if saying goodbye to their departed sibling, sometimes reaching out to touch a small hand or leaning in to whisper a final message. These compositions required careful coaching of the living children, who had to understand the importance of remaining still while processing their own grief and confusion. The psychological impact on living children participating in these photography sessions was a constant concern for mourning photographers. They learned to work with families to prepare children for what would happen, explaining the process in age-appropriate terms, and ensuring that the experience would be comforting rather than traumatic. Some children found closure in these final portraits, while others were too young to understand what was happening. Grandparents were often included in children's mourning portraits, their presence adding generational depth to the composition and suggesting the continuity of family love, even in the face of loss. An elderly grandmother might be shown holding a deceased grandchild, her weathered hands gentle against the child's small form, creating images that spoke of both the circle of life and the special bonds between grandparents and grandchildren. The technical challenges of photographing deceased children required specialized skills and equipment. Children's smaller size meant that standard adult photography setups often didn't work well. Photographers had to adjust camera height, lighting angles, and composition techniques to work effectively with child subjects. They often used smaller cameras and portable equipment that could be more easily maneuvered in children's rooms and nurseries. Lighting for children's portraits required particular subtlety. Children's delicate features could be overwhelmed by harsh lighting, while their pale skin needed careful illumination to avoid a deathly pallor that would disturb rather than comfort viewers. Photographers learned to use soft, diffused light that would create gentle shadows and highlight the child's natural beauty. The seasonal aspects of childhood mourning photography added another layer of symbolism and challenge. Spring flowers suggested new life and renewal, making them popular choices for children's portraits despite the tragic circumstances. Winter scenes might emphasize warmth and comfort, with the child surrounded by cozy blankets and warm colors. Summer allowed for garden settings and outdoor elements, while autumn could suggest the completion of a cycle, however brief. The economic realities of childhood mourning photography were complex and often heartbreaking. Many families could ill afford the cost of photography, yet felt compelled to make this final investment in their child's memory. Photographers often found themselves in the position of providing payment plans, reducing fees, or even working for free when confronted with particularly desperate circumstances. Some photographers developed relationships with local churches, charitable organizations, and community groups that could help subsidize the cost of children's mourning portraits for the poorest families. These arrangements recognized that the emotional and psychological benefits of having a final portrait often outweighed the financial burden, providing comfort that could last for generations. The creation of multiple images of deceased children was common practice among mourning photographers. Families wanted options, perhaps one image of the child alone in peaceful repose, another with favorite toys or flowers, and a third with family members. This approach allowed families to choose the portrait that best captured their memories, while ensuring that the photographer's single opportunity would not be wasted on an unsatisfactory composition. Different poses and compositions were explored to find the most comforting presentation for each individual child. Some photographers specialized in creating elaborate tableaus that told stories about the child's life or interests. A little girl who loved fairy tales might be photographed surrounded by storybook illustrations, while a boy interested in nature could be shown with flowers, butterflies, or small animals. The regional and cultural variations in children's mourning photography reflected different attitudes toward childhood, death, and family relationships. Rural photographers might emphasize natural elements and simplicity, showing children in outdoor settings or with flowers and plants from the family garden. Urban practitioners could offer more elaborate compositions with expensive props, professional backgrounds, and sophisticated lighting arrangements. Religious and cultural backgrounds significantly influenced the approach to photographing deceased children. Catholic families might include religious symbols, crucifixes, or images of saints in their children's portraits. Protestant families often preferred simpler compositions with biblical verses or religious texts. Jewish families had their own traditions and requirements that photographers learned to accommodate respectfully. The training and development of expertise in photographing deceased children was largely through experience and mentorship within the profession. Established mourning photographers would take on apprentices who learned not just the technical aspects of the work, but also the emotional skills required to work with grieving families. The ability to create beautiful, comforting portraits of deceased children became a mark of professional distinction within the field. Documentation and record keeping for children's mourning photography often included special notes about the child's age, circumstances of death, and family preferences. These records helped photographers build reputations for sensitivity and skill in working with bereaved families. Successful children's portraits often led to referrals within communities, as word spread about photographers who could create beautiful, comforting images under the most difficult circumstances. The long-term impact of children's mourning photography extended far beyond the immediate comfort provided to grieving families. These portraits became family heirlooms, passed down through generations as tangible connections to lost children. They served as focal points for family memories and stories, keeping the memory of deceased children alive within family histories. Many families created elaborate memorial displays around their children's posthumous portraits, including locks of hair, favorite toys, and other mementos. These shrines became places of quiet remembrance where family members could go to feel close to their lost children. The photograph served as the centerpiece of these memorials, making the mourning photographer's work an integral part of the family's grieving and healing process. The psychological benefits of children's mourning photography were recognized even in the Victorian era. Physicians and ministers often recommended that families commission these portraits as part of their healing process. The act of creating a beautiful final image could help transform grief into something more manageable, providing families with a positive focus during their darkest hours. The quality and artistry of children's mourning photography varied considerably depending on the photographer's skill and experience. The best practitioners created images of extraordinary beauty and emotional power, transforming tragic circumstances into works of art that celebrated the brief lives they commemorated. These masterful portraits demonstrated how technical skill, artistic vision, and human compassion could combine to create something transcendent from the raw material of grief. Storage and preservation of children's mourning photographs became matters of paramount importance to families. These irreplaceable images were often the family's most precious possessions, protected in elaborate cases and displayed in places of honor within the home. The photographer's choice of materials and processing techniques could determine whether these treasured images would survive for decades or fade away with time. The emotional toll on mourning photographers who specialized in children's portraits was considerable. These compassionate individuals witnessed grief in its rawest form, day after day, season after season. They learned to compartmentalize their emotions while remaining sensitive to their clients' needs. Many developed their own rituals and coping mechanisms to deal with the constant exposure to loss and sorrow. Some photographers found profound meaning in their work with deceased children, viewing themselves as guardians of memory and providers of comfort to families in their greatest need. They took pride in their ability to create beauty from tragedy, to provide lasting solace through their artistry. This sense of mission helped sustain them through the emotional challenges of their profession. As we close tonight's exploration of childhood mourning photography, we leave our Victorian artists in their quiet nurseries and children's bedrooms, working with infinite tenderness to create final portraits of innocence at rest. Their gentle hands arranged toys and flowers, positioned small forms with loving care, and captured light in ways that transformed heartbreak into beauty, creating images that would comfort grieving parents for generations to come. Tomorrow, we will examine the business side of this compassionate profession, exploring how mourning photographers built their enterprises around death and grief, balancing the commercial necessities of their work with the emotional demands of serving families in their darkest hours. In the shadowy world of Victorian commerce, few professions required such delicate balance between profit and compassion as mourning photography. These entrepreneurs of grief built their livelihoods on society's most profound losses, creating businesses that thrived during humanity's darkest moments while providing essential services to families desperate for final memories of their beloved dead. The morning newspaper in Boston, 1852, carried a small, tastefully worded advertisement: post-mortem photography likenesses taken of deceased persons at their residences. Satisfaction guaranteed. Reasonable rates for all circumstances. H. Morrison, daguerreotypist, Washington Street. Such advertisements appeared with increasing frequency in newspapers across America and Britain, marking the emergence of a specialized profession that would flourish for decades. Establishing a mourning photography business required significant capital investment and careful planning. Unlike conventional portrait studios that could operate from fixed locations with regular hours, mourning photographers needed portable equipment, reliable transportation, and the ability to work at any hour of the day or night. Death did not observe business hours, and successful mourning photographers had to be available whenever families needed their services. The initial investment in equipment alone could consume months or even years of savings for aspiring photographers. A complete daguerreotype outfit, including cameras, lenses, plates, chemicals, and processing equipment, might cost between $300 and $500 equivalent to a year's wages for many skilled workers. Add to this the cost of transportation, whether horse and carriage or arrangements with local livery services, and the financial barrier to entry became substantial. Many mourning photographers began their careers as apprentices or assistants to established practitioners, learning the technical and business aspects of the profession while building the capital necessary to establish their own practices. Others transitioned from general portrait photography, adding mourning services to their existing studios as demand grew, and they recognized the financial opportunities presented by this specialized market. The geographic considerations of mourning photography created unique business challenges. Urban photographers could operate from central locations and serve dense populations where potential clients lived within reasonable traveling distance. Rural practitioners often had to cover vast territories, sometimes traveling for days to reach isolated farms and settlements where families had lost loved ones. These extended journeys required careful planning, reliable transportation, and often overnight accommodations away from home. Pricing structures for mourning photography varied considerably based on geographic location, the photographer's reputation, and the specific services requested. A simple daguerreotype portrait of a deceased individual might cost between $2 and $5, while elaborate family compositions with multiple subjects could command $15 to $25 or more. These prices represented significant expenses for most families, often equivalent to a week's wages for skilled workers. The economics of mourning photography were complicated by the emotional nature of the transactions. Unlike other commercial relationships where customers might negotiate prices or comparison shop, grieving families were often in no position to haggle over costs or delay services while seeking better deals. Successful mourning photographers learned to balance their pricing with sensitivity to their clients' emotional state and financial circumstances. Payment arrangements reflected the unique nature of mourning photography services. Many photographers offered installment plans that allowed families to spread costs over several months, recognizing that the immediate period following a death was often financially stressful. Some practitioners maintained relationships with local churches, fraternal organizations, or charitable societies that could provide assistance for families unable to afford their services. The development of payment schedules required considerable judgment and flexibility. A photographer might accept partial payment at the time of service, with the balance due when the finished portrait was delivered. Others required full payment in advance, understanding that grief-stricken families might struggle to meet financial obligations in the weeks following a loss. The most successful practitioners learn to read their clients' circumstances and adapt their payment policies accordingly. Seasonal fluctuations significantly impacted the mourning photography business. Winter months typically brought increased demand as diseases like influenza, pneumonia, and tuberculosis claimed more victims. Summer heat created challenges for the photographic process and increased the urgency of working quickly after death, but also brought higher mortality rates in urban areas where sanitation was poor. Experienced mourning photographers learned to budget for these seasonal variations, saving money during busy periods to sustain themselves through slower times. Competition among mourning photographers varied by location and market size. Large cities might support several specialists, each developing particular reputations or serving different social classes. Small towns typically had room for only one or two practitioners, making reputation and quality crucial for maintaining market dominance. Competition was generally not cutthroat, as the nature of the services required more cooperation than conflict among practitioners. Professional relationships among mourning photographers were often collaborative rather than competitive. Practitioners might refer clients to colleagues when their schedules were full or when specific expertise was needed. Regional networks developed where photographers would recommend trusted colleagues in other areas when families needed services outside their normal territory. These relationships helped ensure that bereaved families received quality services regardless of their location. The development of client relationships was crucial for success in mourning photography. Satisfied families often became sources of referrals within their communities, churches, and social circles. A photographer's reputation for sensitivity, technical skill, and fair dealing could make the difference between a thriving practice and a struggling one. Word-of-mouth recommendations were particularly powerful in this field, as families were more likely to trust photographers recommended by others who had experienced their services during their own times of grief. Marketing mourning photography services required considerable tact and sensitivity. Aggressive advertising was considered inappropriate and could damage a photographer's reputation. Most successful practitioners relied on subtle newspaper advertisements, relationships with local clergy and physicians, and recommendations from funeral directors and other death-related service providers. Building these professional networks was essential for maintaining a steady flow of clients. Funeral directors became particularly important business partners for mourning photographers. These professionals were often the first to interact with bereaved families and could recommend photography services as part of their comprehensive funeral arrangements. Some funeral directors maintained exclusive relationships with particular photographers, while others offered families choices among several recommended practitioners. These partnerships were mutually beneficial, providing photographers with steady referral sources while allowing funeral directors to offer complete memorial services. Physicians and midwives also served as important referral sources, particularly for infant and child photography. Medical professionals who attended deaths in homes were often in positions to suggest memorial photography services to grieving families. Some physicians maintained lists of recommended photographers and would make introductions as part of their post-mortem care for families. Religious leaders played crucial roles in the mourning photography business ecosystem. Ministers, priests, and rabbis often counseled families on memorial practices and could recommend photography services as part of the healing process. Some religious leaders maintained formal relationships with photographers, while others made informal recommendations based on their knowledge of practitioners' reputations and sensitivity to religious customs. The inventory management for mourning photography businesses required careful planning and substantial capital investment. Photographers had to maintain supplies of daguerreotype plates, chemicals, and processing materials sufficient to handle unexpected surges in demand. Running out of essential supplies during a busy period could result in lost business and damaged relationships with referring professionals. Chemical storage and management presented unique challenges for mourning photography businesses. The hazardous nature of many photographic chemicals required special storage facilities and handling procedures. Mercury, used in daguerreotype development, was particularly dangerous and required careful storage away from living areas. Silver nitrate and other chemicals were expensive and had to be protected from contamination and deterioration. Equipment maintenance was crucial for mourning photographers who often worked under challenging conditions in various locations. Cameras and lenses had to be kept in perfect working order, as equipment failures during important sessions could have devastating consequences for both photographer and client relationships. Many practitioners became skilled at field repairs and carried basic tools and spare parts for emergency situations. Transportation logistics formed a critical component of mourning photography business operations. Photographers needed reliable means of reaching clients quickly, often at irregular hours, and in various weather conditions. Horse-drawn carriages were the standard transportation method, requiring either ownership of horses and vehicles or reliable arrangements with livery services. The costs of transportation could represent significant portions of operating expenses, particularly for rural practitioners covering large territories. Insurance and liability considerations were emerging concerns for mourning photography businesses. The valuable equipment required for the profession needed protection against theft, damage, and loss. Some photographers also carried insurance against business interruption, recognizing that equipment failures or health problems could temporarily halt their ability to earn income. Liability insurance was less common, but some practitioners carried coverage against potential claims related to property damage or personal injury during their work. Record keeping and business documentation were essential for successful mourning photography enterprises. Photographers maintained detailed client records, including contact information, services provided, prices charged, and payment status. These records served multiple purposes. They provided references for future family needs, helped track financial performance, and could serve as evidence of professional reputation when seeking referrals or business loans. Financial management required particular skills given the unpredictable nature of mourning photography demand. Photographers had to plan for irregular income streams, with busy periods followed by slower times when few services were needed. Successful practitioners learned to save money during profitable periods and maintain sufficient reserves to cover operating expenses during slower times. Banking relationships were important for mourning photographers who often dealt with substantial cash transactions and needed credit facilities for equipment purchases and business expansion. Some banks were hesitant to work with death-related businesses, viewing them as somehow unsavory or risky. Progressive bankers recognized the legitimate nature of these enterprises and the consistent demand for their services within growing communities. Business expansion strategies for mourning photographers often focused on geographic growth rather than service diversification. Successful practitioners might open satellite offices in nearby towns or establish relationships with local agents who could represent their services in distant areas. Some photographers trained associates who could handle routine assignments, while the principal photographer focused on more complex or prestigious commissions. Specialization within mourning photography allowed some practitioners to command premium prices and develop distinguished reputations. Photographers who became known for exceptional work with children, elaborate family compositions, or particular artistic styles could often charge higher fees and attract clients from greater distances. This specialization required continuous skill development and investment in superior equipment and materials. Professional development opportunities for mourning photographers were limited but important for maintaining competitive advantages. Practitioners attended photography exhibitions, corresponded with colleagues in other cities, and experimented with new techniques and materials. Those who stayed current with technological developments and artistic trends could offer superior services and maintain leadership positions in their markets. Employee management became necessary for successful mourning photography businesses as they grew. Photographers might employ assistants who could help with equipment transport, client relations, and routine processing tasks. Training these employees required considerable time and attention, as they needed both technical skills and the sensitivity required for working with grieving families. Quality control measures were essential for maintaining reputation and client satisfaction in mourning photography. Photographers had to ensure consistent technical quality while working under various conditions and time pressures. Developing standard procedures for different types of assignments helped ensure reliable results regardless of specific circumstances encountered in the field. Customer service extended far beyond the actual photography session for mourning photographers. These practitioners often found themselves providing emotional support, practical advice, and ongoing assistance to bereaved families, following up after service delivery, checking on client satisfaction, and maintaining long-term relationships with families helped build the loyal customer base essential for business success. Technological adaptation was crucial for mourning photographers who needed to adopt new photographic processes and equipment as they became available. The transition from daguerreotypes to newer processes like albumen printing required significant investment in new equipment and training while maintaining compatibility with existing client expectations and pricing structures. Legal considerations for mourning photography businesses included contracts for services, liability limitations, and intellectual property rights regarding the photographs created. Some photographers developed standard contract language that specified services to be provided, payment terms, and delivery schedules. Understanding local laws regarding death certification, body handling, and photography permissions was essential for avoiding legal complications. Retirement planning presented unique challenges for mourning photographers whose businesses were often built around personal relationships and individual skills. Unlike other enterprises that could be easily sold or transferred, mourning photography practices were deeply personal endeavors that reflected the practitioner's reputation and relationships within the community. Some photographers trained successors who could gradually take over client relationships, while others simply closed their practices when they could no longer work effectively. The legacy of successful mourning photography businesses extended beyond their immediate commercial success. These enterprises served essential social functions during periods when death was more visible and immediate in people's lives. They provided comfort to countless families while creating permanent records of individuals who might otherwise have been forgotten by history. The photographs they produced became family treasures, preserved for generations as tangible connections to lost loved ones. Behind every daguerreotype plate capturing a final farewell, behind every carefully arranged composition of flowers and grief, stood individual artists whose names have largely faded from history, but whose work shaped how entire generations approached death and memory. These masters of mourning photography were more than mere technicians with cameras. They were pioneers who established an entirely new profession, created artistic standards that would endure for decades, and provided comfort to thousands of families during their darkest hours. In the bustling streets of Boston during the 1840s, Albert Southworth and Josiah Hawes operated what would become America's most renowned daguerreotype studio. While they are remembered today primarily for their portraits of living subjects, including celebrities and politicians, a significant portion of their practice involved the delicate art of mourning photography. Their Boston studio on Tremont Road became a destination for grieving families throughout New England who sought the finest possible memorial portraits of their departed loved ones. Southworth, the senior partner, had originally trained as a pharmacist before being captivated by Daguerre's revolutionary invention. His scientific background proved invaluable in mastering the complex chemistry required for consistent, high-quality daguerreotypes. Hawes brought artistic sensibility and a gentle temperament particularly suited to working with bereaved families. Together, they created some of the most technically perfect and emotionally moving mourning photographs of the Victorian era. Their approach to post-mortem photography was revolutionary for its time. While many photographers focused primarily on technical accuracy, Southworth and Hawes understood that their mourning portraits needed to provide emotional comfort as well as physical likeness. They developed techniques for lighting and posing that gave their subjects an ethereal, peaceful quality that suggested rest rather than death. Their careful attention to symbolic details, the placement of flowers, the arrangement of clothing, the inclusion of meaningful objects elevated their work from simple documentation to profound artistry. One of their most celebrated mourning photographs depicted a young child surrounded by white roses, positioned as if sleeping in a garden. The composition was so natural and peaceful that viewers often had to look carefully to realize they were viewing a post-mortem portrait. This image became a model for child mourning photography throughout New England, with other photographers attempting to replicate its serene beauty and emotional impact. The partnership between Southworth and Hawes extended beyond their Boston studio to include extensive travel throughout New England, bringing their services to families in smaller towns and rural areas. They were among the first mourning photographers to recognize the importance of serving clients in their own homes rather than requiring families to transport their deceased loved ones to studios. This innovation required developing portable equipment and techniques that could produce studio-quality results in challenging domestic environments. In New York City, Jeremiah Gurney established what would become one of America's most successful and influential photography studios, opening his Broadway gallery in 1840, just 1 year after the daguerreotype process was announced in America. Gurney quickly gained a reputation for both technical excellence and sensitive handling of mourning photography clients. His studio became a gathering place for New York's grief-stricken families, and his work set standards for professional mourning photography throughout the eastern United States. Gurney's background in jewelry making and engraving provided him with the fine motor skills and attention to detail essential for daguerreotype work. He was particularly skilled at the delicate process of hand-coloring daguerreotypes, adding subtle tints that brought warmth and life to memorial portraits. His colored mourning photographs were especially popular for children's portraits, where soft pink cheeks and golden hair could transform stark silver images into more comforting memories. The Gurney studio pioneered several innovations in mourning photography technique and presentation. They developed specialized mounting and casing systems that better protected delicate daguerreotypes while creating more elegant presentations worthy of prominent display in Victorian parlors. Their cases often featured elaborate designs incorporating mourning symbols like weeping willows, urns, and religious imagery, making the physical presentation as meaningful as the photograph itself. Gurney's business model influenced mourning photography practice throughout America. He established satellite studios in other major cities, training local photographers in his techniques while maintaining quality standards across all locations bearing his name. This expansion allowed the Gurney brand to serve families across a much wider geographic area while providing employment and training opportunities for numerous aspiring photographers. Matthew Brady, though primarily remembered today for his Civil War photography, began his career as a portrait photographer in New York and Washington, D.C., and maintained a substantial mourning photography practice throughout his career. Brady's scientific approach to photography and his innovations in studio lighting proved particularly valuable in post-mortem work, where technical precision was essential for creating satisfactory results under challenging conditions. Brady's mourning photographs were characterized by their exceptional clarity and detail, achieved through careful attention to camera settings, lighting angles, and chemical processing. He was among the first photographers to systematically document his techniques, keeping detailed records of exposure times, chemical concentrations, and processing procedures that allowed him to achieve consistent results regardless of varying conditions. These records became valuable resources for other photographers seeking to improve their own mourning photography skills. The Brady studios in New York and Washington served some of the most prominent families in American society, creating memorial portraits for politicians, military officers, and wealthy merchants. Brady's reputation for discretion and professionalism made him a preferred choice for families who required both technical excellence and complete confidentiality regarding their private brief. In Philadelphia, Frederick Langenheim and his brother William established a photography business that would become renowned throughout the Mid-Atlantic region for both innovation and artistry. The Langenheim brothers were among the first American photographers to experiment with the calotype process developed by William Henry Fox Talbot, though they continued to use daguerreotypes for their mourning photography work due to the superior detail and permanence required for memorial portraits. Frederick Langenheim's European training provided him with artistic perspectives that distinguished his mourning photographs from those of many American contemporaries. His compositions often incorporated elements inspired by European memorial painting traditions, creating photographs that resembled classical mourning portraits while taking advantage of photography's superior accuracy and detail. His work appealed particularly to Philadelphia's large German immigrant population, whose mourning customs emphasized elaborate visual remembrance of the deceased. The Langenheim studio developed specialized techniques for creating multiple copies of mourning photographs, recognizing that bereaved families often wanted to share memorial images with relatives and friends. Their innovations in duplicating daguerreotypes allowed them to provide affordable copies while maintaining the quality of the original, making memorial photography accessible to a broader range of social classes. In rural New England, itinerant photographer Anson Clark built a reputation that extended throughout Vermont, New Hampshire, and western Massachusetts, despite operating without a fixed studio location. Clark's horse-drawn darkroom wagon became a familiar sight on country roads as he traveled from farm to farm, providing mourning photography services to families who had no access to urban studios. His mobile operation required exceptional skill in maintaining equipment and chemical quality while working under constantly changing conditions. Clark's specialization in rural mourning photography led him to develop unique techniques adapted to agricultural settings and customs. His photographs often incorporated elements of rural life, farm tours, garden flowers, domestic animals that reflected the deceased's connection to the land and their way of life. These personalized touches made his work particularly meaningful to farming families whose lives were intimately connected to seasonal cycles and natural rhythms. The challenges of itinerant mourning photography required Clark to develop extraordinary flexibility and adaptability. He worked in farmhouse kitchens, converted barns into temporary studios, and learned to create acceptable results using whatever light and space were available. His success demonstrated that high-quality mourning photography was possible even in the most challenging circumstances, inspiring other photographers to extend their services to underserved rural populations. Samuel Mashery operated studios in both Boston and Providence, becoming one of New England's most prolific mourning photographers. His business model emphasized volume and efficiency while maintaining consistent quality, allowing him to serve a broader range of clients at more affordable prices than many of his competitors. Mashery's democratic approach to mourning photography helped establish the practice among middle-class families who previously could not afford such services. Mashery's innovations in studio organization and workflow allowed him to handle multiple mourning photography assignments in a single day when necessary, crucial during epidemic periods when death rates spiked dramatically. His systematic approach to equipment maintenance, chemical preparation, and client scheduling ensured that quality never suffered despite the pressure of increased demand during crisis periods. The training programs Mashery developed for his assistants became models for professional education in mourning photography. His detailed instruction manuals covered not only technical procedures, but also appropriate behavior when working with grieving families, proper handling of deceased subjects, and business practices that balance profitability with compassion. Several of his former assistants went on to establish successful mourning photography practices of their own throughout New England. Napoleon Sarony, though later famous for his theatrical portraits and celebrity photographs, began his career in part through mourning photography work in New York and Philadelphia. Sarony's artistic background and European training brought a sophisticated aesthetic sensibility to American mourning photography that influenced practitioners throughout the eastern United States. Sarony's mourning photographs were distinguished by their careful attention to symbolic composition and their incorporation of artistic elements drawn from European memorial painting traditions. He was among the first American photographers to experiment with dramatic lighting effects in post-mortem work, creating images that suggested spiritual transcendence rather than merely documenting physical death. His artistic approach appealed particularly to families seeking memorial portraits that emphasized the deceased's cultural sophistication and social status. The technical innovations Sarony introduced to American mourning photography included improved methods for hand-coloring daguerreotypes and more sophisticated approaches to retouching that could minimize the visible effects of illness or injury while maintaining natural appearance. His workshops and demonstrations helped spread these advanced techniques among other photographers seeking to improve their artistic capabilities. George Stacy operated a successful mourning photography practice in rural Ohio, serving farming communities throughout the central part of the state. Stacy's background as a minister provided him with unusual insight into the spiritual and emotional needs of bereaved families, allowing him to create memorial photographs that served therapeutic as well as commemorative functions. His combination of photographic skill and pastoral sensitivity made him exceptionally effective at working with families struggling with profound grief. Stacy's mourning photographs often incorporated religious symbolism and biblical references that reflected both his own background and the deep faith of many of his rural clients. His images frequently included open Bibles, religious texts, and crosses, creating compositions that emphasized hope for eternal reunion rather than focusing on earthly loss. This approach proved particularly comforting to devoutly religious families whose mourning practices were deeply integrated with their spiritual beliefs. The geographic isolation of many of Stacy's clients required him to develop exceptional skills in portable photography and field processing. He created a mobile darkroom system that could produce finished daguerreotypes in remote locations without access to permanent facilities or consistent power sources. His innovations in portable equipment design were adopted by other itinerant photographers throughout the Midwest. James Wallace Black established his Boston studio in the 1850s and quickly gained recognition for technical innovation and artistic excellence in mourning photography. Black's scientific approach to photography led him to conduct extensive experiments with different chemical formulations, exposure techniques, and processing methods specifically optimized for post-mortem work. His systematic research into the technical challenges of mourning photography resulted in significant improvements in image quality and consistency. Black's mourning photographs were characterized by exceptional sharpness and tonal quality, achieved through his careful optimization of every aspect of the photographic process. He developed specialized techniques for working in poorly lit domestic environments, using mirrors and reflectors to create lighting conditions that would produce acceptable results even in heavily curtained Victorian parlors. His technical innovations were widely adopted by other practitioners seeking to improve their own results. The educational programs Black established for training mourning photographers helped professionalize the field and establish consistent standards for technical quality and appropriate client relations. His detailed instruction in both technical procedures and business practices provided a foundation for numerous photographers who would carry his methods throughout New England and beyond. In Chicago, Alexander Hessler built a reputation that extended throughout the Midwest for both artistic sensitivity and technical excellence in mourning photography. Hessler's background in landscape photography provided him with exceptional skills in natural lighting and outdoor composition that proved valuable when creating memorial portraits in natural settings. His innovations in combining mourning photography with landscape elements created a distinctive style that appealed to families seeking more naturalistic memorial imagery. Hessler's business philosophy emphasized the importance of understanding each family's specific needs and preferences, rather than applying standardized approaches to all mourning photography assignments. He spent considerable time consulting with clients before each session, learning about the deceased's personality, interests, and the family's mourning customs. This personalized approach resulted in memorial portraits that reflected individual character rather than generic mourning imagery. The technical workshops Hessler conducted for other photographers helped spread advanced mourning photography techniques throughout the rapidly growing Midwest. His emphasis on adapting techniques to local conditions and cultural preferences helped establish regional variations in mourning photography style that reflected the diverse populations settling the American frontier. These master practitioners of mourning photography, though largely forgotten by general history, played crucial roles in establishing professional standards, artistic approaches, and business practices that would define the field for decades. Their individual innovations in technique, their sensitivity to client needs, and their success in building sustainable businesses around society's most difficult moments created the foundation upon which thousands of other mourning photographers would build their own careers. The legacy of these pioneering artists extends far beyond their technical contributions to photography. Their work provided comfort to countless families during periods of profound grief, created permanent records of individuals who might otherwise have been forgotten, and established photography as an essential component of Victorian mourning practices. Their portraits continue to serve as windows into both individual lives and broader social customs, preserving not only physical appearances but also insights into how entire generations approach death, memory, and the preservation of love beyond the grave. Victorian society transformed death from a private family matter into an elaborate social ritual, complete with prescribed customs, symbolic elements, and carefully orchestrated ceremonies that could extend for months or even years. Within this complex framework of mourning traditions, post-mortem photography found its place not as a morbid curiosity, but as an essential component of proper grief observance, a final act of devotion that demonstrated both family love and social respectability. The integration of death photography into Victorian mourning customs began almost immediately upon the arrival of daguerreotype technology in the early 1840s. Families who had previously commissioned painted mourning portraits from artists quickly recognized that photography offered superior accuracy at reduced cost, making memorial imagery accessible to social classes that had never before been able to afford such luxuries. The photograph became not merely a record of appearance, but a sacred object around which new mourning rituals developed. The timing of post-mortem photography sessions was carefully integrated into the broader schedule of Victorian death customs. Most families arranged for photography to occur during the traditional lying-in period, when the deceased remained in the family home for viewing by relatives, friends, and community members. This period, typically lasting 2 to 4 days depending on weather conditions and family preferences, provided the window of opportunity during which photography could be successfully accomplished while the deceased remained suitable for portraiture. The photographer's arrival at a house of mourning was governed by specific social protocols that reflected both the solemnity of the occasion and the practical requirements of the photographic process. Professional mourning photographers learned to approach grieving families with appropriate reverence, speaking in hushed tones, moving quietly through the household, and demonstrating proper respect for both the deceased and the family's grief. Their behavior during these sessions often influenced whether families would recommend their services to others in their social circles. The preparation of the home for post-mortem photography involved elaborate rituals that combined practical necessities with symbolic observances. Windows were often covered with heavy black crepe or curtains as signs of mourning, but these had to be adjusted or temporarily removed to provide sufficient light for photography. The photographer worked with family members to balance mourning customs with photographic requirements, creating compromises that honored both traditions and technical needs. Religious considerations played crucial roles in determining how death photography sessions were conducted and integrated into mourning observances. Protestant families generally embraced post-mortem photography as an acceptable form of memorial creation, viewing it as a way to preserve God's handiwork in human form. Catholic families sometimes sought guidance from their priests regarding the appropriateness of photographing the dead, with individual clergy members varying in their acceptance of the practice. Jewish mourning customs presented particular challenges for death photographers, as traditional practices emphasized rapid burial and restricted handling of the deceased. Some Orthodox families declined photography services entirely, while others found ways to accommodate both religious requirements and their desire for memorial images. Reformed Jewish families were generally more accepting of post-mortem photography, particularly when it could be accomplished without significantly delaying burial preparations. The role of clergy in death photography sessions varied considerably based on individual attitudes and denominational policies. Some ministers, priests, and rabbis actively encouraged families to commission memorial photographs as part of their healing process, viewing the images as comforting reminders of their loved ones' earthly forms. Others remained neutral on the subject, neither encouraging nor discouraging the practice. A few religious leaders opposed death photography on theological grounds, though such opposition became less common as the practice gained social acceptance. The selection of clothing for post-mortem photography subjects was governed by complex social customs that reflected both mourning traditions and the family's desire to present their loved one in the most flattering possible manner. White clothing was almost universally preferred for children and young adults, symbolizing innocence and purity while creating striking photographic contrast. Adult subjects were typically dressed in their finest garments, Sunday clothes, wedding attire, or clothing associated with significant life events. The preparation of deceased subjects for photography involved intimate family rituals that combined practical grooming with emotional expressions of continuing love and care. Female family members typically took responsibility for washing, dressing, and arranging the deceased, treating these tasks as final acts of devotion. Hair was carefully arranged, cosmetics applied when appropriate, and jewelry selected to enhance the subject's appearance and reflect their social status. The arrangement of the photography setting within the home became a collaborative ritual involving family members, the photographer, and sometimes neighbors or friends who assisted with preparations. Furniture was moved to create optimal lighting conditions and camera positions, while maintaining appropriate dignity for the solemnity of the occasion. The family's best linens, most beautiful flowers, and most precious possessions were often incorporated into the photographic composition. Flower selection and arrangement for death photography followed specific symbolic traditions that added layers of meaning to the memorial images. White roses represented eternal love and the purity of the deceased soul, while lilies symbolized resurrection and the hope of reunion in the afterlife. Forget-me-nots carried obvious messages of remembrance, and ivy represented fidelity and eternal bonds. Families often selected flowers that had special significance to the deceased or that came from their own gardens, adding personal meaning to the symbolic arrangements. The inclusion of personal belongings in death photography compositions served both practical and emotional purposes within Victorian mourning customs. Favorite books, toys, musical instruments, or tools of trade helped to personalize the images and remind viewers of the deceased's earthly interests and accomplishments. These objects also provided comfort to grieving family members by connecting the memorial image to happy memories of their loved one's life activities. Family participation in post-mortem photography sessions became elaborate rituals that served multiple social and emotional functions. The gathering of extended family members for these sessions provided opportunities for collective grieving and mutual support during difficult times. The process of planning and executing the photography session gave family members constructive activities to focus on during the immediate aftermath of their loss. The photography session itself became a solemn ceremony requiring coordination among multiple participants. Living family members who were to be included in group portraits had to prepare themselves emotionally and physically for the challenging task of posing with their deceased loved one while remaining motionless during lengthy exposures. Children participating in these sessions often required special coaching and support to help them understand and cope with the experience. The waiting period for completed photographs created its own set of customs and expectations within Victorian mourning observances. Families anticipated the delivery of finished images with mixture of eagerness and dread, knowing that the photographs would provide lasting comfort, but also serve as stark reminders of their loss. The photographer's delivery of completed images often became ceremonial occasions when family members gathered to view the results together. The presentation and display of death photographs within Victorian homes followed specific customs that reflected both the image's sacred significance and their role in ongoing mourning observances. Memorial photographs were typically given places of honor in family parlors, often accompanied by flowers, candles, and other mourning paraphernalia. Some families created elaborate memorial displays that included the photograph along with locks of hair, favorite possessions, and written tributes. The sharing of death photographs among family members and friends became important social rituals that extended the mourning observance beyond the immediate household. Copies of memorial images were distributed to relatives, close friends, and sometimes business associates as ways of including broader social circles in the grief experience. The act of sharing these intimate images demonstrated trust and invited recipients to participate in the family's mourning process. Social calls to view death photographs became accepted customs within Victorian society, with visitors expected to offer appropriate condolences and admiration for the photographic results. These visits served important social functions, allowing community members to demonstrate their respect for the deceased and support for the surviving family, while providing opportunities for shared grieving and mutual comfort. The anniversary observances of death dates often incorporated the memorial photographs as focal points for family remembrance rituals. Annual gatherings to view and discuss the images helped maintain connections to deceased family members while providing ongoing comfort to survivors. These anniversary customs could continue for many years, with the photographs serving as permanent triggers for family memories and stories. Wedding customs sometimes incorporated memorial photographs of deceased family members as ways of including lost loved ones in joyful celebrations. Brides might carry small versions of parents' or siblings' death photographs, while families displayed memorial images alongside wedding decorations to symbolically include deceased relatives in the festivities. These practices reflected Victorian beliefs in continuing family bonds that transcended death. Holiday observances frequently included ritual attention to death photographs as ways of maintaining family unity across the divide between living and dead. Christmas, Easter, and other significant holidays provided occasions for families to gather around memorial images, share memories, and demonstrate ongoing love for their departed relatives. Fresh flowers were often placed near the photographs during these seasonal celebrations. The creation of mourning jewelry incorporating elements from death photographs became popular customs among Victorian families. Lockets containing tiny versions of memorial images, brooches with photographic elements, and rings incorporating hair from the deceased, along with miniature photographs, allowed family members to carry physical reminders of their loved ones in socially acceptable forms. Letter writing customs among Victorian families often reference death photographs as ways of sharing grief experiences with distant relatives and friends. Detailed descriptions of photography sessions, reactions to completed images, and the comfort derived from viewing memorial photographs became common elements in family correspondence, helping to maintain emotional connections across geographic distances. The storage and preservation of death photographs developed into careful family customs designed to protect these precious images for future generations. Special albums, protective cases, and storage methods were employed to ensure that memorial photographs would survive to provide comfort and historical connection for descendants who had never known the deceased subjects. Educational customs within Victorian families included teaching children about deceased relatives through viewing and discussing their memorial photographs. These sessions served multiple purposes. They helped maintain family history, provided comfort during ongoing grief processes, and taught young people about mortality and family continuity in socially appropriate ways. The economic customs surrounding death photography reflected both its importance within mourning observances and its accessibility across social classes. Families often made significant financial sacrifices to afford memorial photography, viewing the expense as essential rather than optional. Payment customs included installment plans, community fundraising for indigent families, and charitable contributions to ensure that all families could access these important services. Regional variations in death photography customs reflected different cultural backgrounds, economic conditions, and social traditions among Victorian communities. Urban families might emphasize elaborate studio quality results, while rural families focused on simpler, more naturalistic approaches that reflected their agricultural lifestyles. Immigrant communities often incorporated elements from their ancestral traditions into American mourning photography customs. The seasonal aspects of death photography customs required families to adapt their observances to weather conditions and other practical considerations. Winter deaths might be accompanied by photography sessions that emphasized warmth and comfort, while summer losses required rapid action to complete photography before heat affected the deceased's condition. Spring and autumn deaths allowed for incorporation of seasonal flowers and natural elements that added symbolic meaning to memorial images. Professional customs among mourning photographers themselves developed to ensure appropriate behavior and mutual support within this specialized field. Practitioners shared information about techniques, referred clients to colleagues when necessary, and maintained professional standards that protected the reputation of death photography as a legitimate and valuable service to grieving families. The legal customs surrounding death photography were minimal during the Victorian era, but photographers and families developed informal protocols regarding permission, payment, and image ownership that protected everyone's interests. These customs evolved to address questions about who could authorize photography sessions, how images could be used, and what rights family members retained regarding their memorial photographs. As Victorian mourning customs became more elaborate and socially codified, death photography found its permanent place within the complex framework of proper grief observance, serving not merely as a photographic service, but as an integral component of how families honor their dead, process their grief, and maintained connections to loved ones whose earthly presence had ended, but whose memory remained precious beyond measure. The quiet revolution that transformed mourning photography from the 1850s through the 1870s occurred not through dramatic announcements or grand unveilings, but through the gradual adoption of new chemical processes, improved materials, and innovative techniques that made memorial imagery more accessible, more durable, and more beautiful than ever before. This technical evolution would democratize death photography, bringing it within reach of working-class families while elevating its artistic possibilities to unprecedented heights. In a London photography studio, 1856, Charles Whitman carefully prepared a glass plate coated with collodion, a mixture of gun cotton dissolved in ether and alcohol. The plate, sensitized with silver bromide, would soon capture the image of a young mother who had died in childbirth, creating not a unique daguerreotype that could never be duplicated, but a negative from which multiple positive prints could be made for distribution to her extended family. This single technical advancement, the ability to create multiple copies from one negative, would transform mourning photography from an exclusive luxury into a widely accessible comfort. The limitations of the daguerreotype process had constrained mourning photography since its inception. Each daguerreotype was a unique object, created directly on a silver-plated copper sheet with no possibility of duplication. Families who wanted to share memorial images with distant relatives or create copies for safekeeping had to commission entirely separate photography sessions or rely on painted copies made from the original daguerreotype. The process was expensive, time-consuming, and often resulted in variations between different versions of the same subject. The introduction of the collodion wet plate process in the early 1850s offered mourning photographers their first practical method for creating multiple copies of memorial images. Frederick Scott Archer's invention used glass plates coated with collodion as the base for light-sensitive emulsions, creating negatives from which unlimited positive prints could be made. This breakthrough transformed the economics and accessibility of mourning photography while opening new artistic possibilities that had been impossible with daguerreotypes. The technical demands of the collodion process required mourning photographers to master entirely new skills and invest in additional equipment. Unlike daguerreotypes, which were processed using mercury vapor in relatively simple apparatus, collodion negatives required more complex chemistry and precise timing. The glass plates had to be coated with collodion, sensitized with silver nitrate solution, exposed while still wet, and developed immediately after exposure, all within a span of minutes before the collodion dried and became insensitive to light. This wet plate process created significant challenges for mourning photographers who often worked in clients' homes rather than fully equipped studios. They had to transport not only cameras and lenses, but portable darkrooms complete with chemical baths, glass plates, and developing apparatus. Many practitioners designed specialized traveling cases that could be quickly converted into functional darkrooms in parlors, bedrooms, or any available space with adequate ventilation. The collodion process offered several advantages that made it particularly suitable for mourning photography. The glass plate negatives were capable of recording finer detail than daguerreotypes, capturing subtle textures in fabrics, delicate features in faces, and intricate arrangements of flowers and personal objects. The ability to create multiple prints meant that families could share memorial images with relatives, preserve copies against loss or damage, and create different presentations for various purposes. The development of albumen printing paper in the mid-1850s provided mourning photographers with their first practical method for creating permanent photographic prints from collodion negatives. Albumen paper, made by coating paper with egg white mixed with salt and then sensitizing it with silver nitrate, produced prints with rich tonal gradation and excellent detail retention that surpassed anything previously available in photography. Louis de Sir Blanquet Everard's albumen paper manufacturing process made these superior printing materials widely available to photographers throughout Europe and America. The paper's warm, golden brown tones proved particularly attractive for mourning photography, creating images that seemed to glow within a light rather than displaying the cold, metallic appearance of daguerreotypes. This warmer tonality made memorial photographs more emotionally appealing and easier for grieving families to display in their homes. The printing process for albumen photographs required considerable skill and patience, particularly when creating multiple copies of mourning photographs for large families. Each print had to be made by contact exposure, placing the negative directly against the sensitized paper and exposing it to sunlight or artificial light sources. The exposure times varied based on lighting conditions, negative density, and desired print quality, requiring experienced judgment to achieve consistent results. The washing and toning procedures for albumen prints were critical for achieving archival permanence essential for mourning photographs that families expected to preserve for generations. Prints had to be thoroughly washed to remove all traces of processing chemicals, then toned with gold chloride solutions to improve their stability and enhance their visual appearance. Properly processed albumen prints could last for decades without significant fading or deterioration. The carte de visite format, introduced in the late 1850s, revolutionized the presentation and distribution of mourning photographs. These small, standardized photographs mounted on cardboard backing could be easily mailed to distant relatives, collected in family albums, and displayed in special viewing cases designed for the purpose. The compact size and durability of carte de visite mourning portraits made them practical for sharing grief across great distances and preserving family memories in portable forms. A&DR Adolphi et Eugene Distrais carte de visite camera, which could expose 8 separate images on a single glass plate, made multiple mourning portraits economically feasible for middle-class families. The reduced cost per image allowed families to order dozens of copies of memorial photographs, ensuring that all relatives and close friends could receive remembrances of the deceased. This accessibility transformed mourning photography from an exclusive luxury into a standard component of proper funeral observances. The cabinet card format, developed in the 1860s, provided mourning photographers with larger presentation options that offered more space for elaborate compositions while maintaining the convenience of standardized mounting and display systems. Cabinet cards measured approximately 6.5 by 4.25 inches, large enough to show fine detail in group portraits and complex arrangements while remaining compact enough for practical handling and storing. The technical improvements in lenses during this period significantly enhanced the quality of mourning photography. The introduction of rapid rectilinear lenses and improved pixel designs reduced exposure times while maintaining sharpness across the entire image field. These advances were particularly important for mourning photography, where precise detail was essential and working conditions often involved less than optimal lighting. The development of more sensitive photographic emulsions reduced exposure times from the minutes required for daguerreotypes to seconds for collodion plates. This improvement was crucial for mourning photographers working with families included in group portraits, as living subjects could more easily maintain poses for shorter periods. The reduced exposure times also minimized the risk of camera shake and subject movement that could ruin irreplaceable memorial images. Artificial lighting techniques evolved significantly during this period, providing mourning photographers with better control over image quality regardless of natural lighting conditions. Magnesium flash powder, introduced in the 1860s, offered intense, brief illumination that could freeze any potential subject movement while providing adequate light for proper exposure. However, the dangerous and unpredictable nature of early flash powder limited its use in mourning photography, where quiet, reverent conditions were essential. The introduction of gas lighting systems in photography studios provided more controllable artificial illumination for mourning photographers working in their own facilities. Gas flames could be adjusted for intensity and position to create desired lighting effects, though the heat and fumes they produced made them unsuitable for use in clients' homes. Studio-based mourning photography became more common as these lighting improvements made indoor photography more practical and predictable. Color enhancement techniques evolved from simple hand tinting of daguerreotypes to sophisticated applications of transparent watercolors on albumen prints. Skilled colorists could add realistic flesh tones, enhance clothing colors, and create more lifelike appearances in mourning photographs. This coloring work was particularly popular for children's memorial portraits, where subtle pink cheeks and golden hair could make the images more comforting for grieving parents. The development of standardized mounting and presentation formats made mourning photographs more attractive and durable, while reducing costs through mass production of albums, cases, and display materials. Specialized mourning photograph albums featured black pages with gold corners and spaces specifically designed for memorial images, while ornate cases with religious or mourning symbols provided appropriate presentations for individual portraits. Retouching techniques advanced considerably during this period, allowing mourning photographers to minimize the visible effects of illness or injury while maintaining natural appearances. Skilled retouchers could remove blemishes, enhance facial features, and create more flattering presentations without obvious artificiality. This capability was particularly important for mourning photography, where families wanted their loved ones to appear at their best in final portraits. The preservation techniques for photographic materials improved significantly as understanding of chemical stability advanced. Photographers learned to use purer chemicals, more thorough washing procedures, and protective treatments that extended the life of both negatives and prints. These improvements were crucial for mourning photographs, which families expected to preserve as permanent memorials. Storage systems for photographic materials evolved to protect both working supplies and finished images from environmental damage. Photographers developed better methods for storing glass plate negatives, sensitized papers, and finished prints to prevent deterioration from moisture, light, and chemical contamination. Proper storage became essential as photographers accumulated larger archives of client negatives and families sought to preserve their memorial photographs for future generations. Quality control procedures became more systematic as photographers gained experience with new processes and materials. Standardized testing methods for chemicals, systematic record keeping for successful procedures, and careful monitoring of processing conditions helped ensure consistent results in mourning photography, where success was measured not only by technical quality, but also by emotional impact on grieving families. The economics of mourning photography changed dramatically as new processes reduced material costs and enabled multiple print production, while individual prints became less expensive. Photographers could maintain profitability through volume sales of multiple copies to extended families. This shift made mourning photography accessible to working-class families while providing photographers with more stable income streams. Training and education for mourning photographers had to evolve rapidly to keep pace with technical developments. Practitioners who had mastered daguerreotype techniques found themselves learning entirely new processes, often through trial and error or informal apprenticeships with more experienced colleagues. The complexity of new processes required more extensive technical knowledge and greater investment in equipment and materials. Regional adoption of new photographic processes varied considerably based on local economic conditions, availability of supplies, and conservative attitudes toward change. Urban photographers typically adopted new techniques more quickly than their rural counterparts, who often continued using daguerreotype methods well into the 1860s. This variation meant that mourning photography techniques and quality could differ significantly between different geographic areas during transition periods. International influences on American mourning photography became more significant as improved communication and transportation facilitated the exchange of technical knowledge and artistic ideas. European innovations in photographic processes, printing techniques, and artistic approaches influenced American practitioners, while American developments in mass production and standardization affected European practices. The scientific understanding of photographic processes advanced considerably during this period, leading to more rational approaches to chemistry, exposure calculation, and quality control. Photographers began to understand the underlying principles behind their techniques rather than relying entirely on empirical methods, leading to more consistent results and better problem-solving capabilities when difficulties arose. Patent disputes and commercial competition drove rapid innovation in photographic materials and techniques as inventors and manufacturers sought to develop superior products that could command premium prices. This competitive environment accelerated the pace of technical development while sometimes creating confusion among photographers trying to evaluate competing claims about new processes and materials. The technical literature available to mourning photographers expanded significantly during this period, with photography journals, instruction manuals, and commercial catalogs providing detailed information about new processes, equipment, and techniques. This educational material helped practitioners stay current with developments while providing guidance for adopting new methods safely and effectively. As the technical foundation of mourning photography evolved from daguerreotypes through collodion wet plates to albumen printing, the profession itself transformed from an exclusive craft serving wealthy families to an accessible service that could provide comfort to bereaved families across all social classes. The technical improvements that enabled multiple copies, reduced costs, and improved quality helped establish mourning photography as an integral component of Victorian funeral customs, ensuring that the gentle art of memorial portraiture would continue to flourish through the remainder of the 19th century.